My name is Sean Chandler. If you don't know me, a bunch of you have been walking up to me saying, "That only." To a small group of people, yes, my mother also does think I'm famous. But so, I've actually been attending here since 2008. How many of you were born after 2008?
Me!
So that sort of thing makes me feel so old when I think I've been attending this church longer and working in the student ministry in certain senses here since before a bunch of you were born. But so this past week was our backyard Bible clubs. So this week's So this week's talk is kind of intentionally kind of unpacking what went down this last week and why it was awesome. So a bunch of you participated in that. Some of you weren't able to. Some of you are guests. And so hopefully you'll be able to understand what our church is all about in light of what happened this last week. So I am old enough that I was actually a part of backyard Bible clubs the very first time that one of the churches in our association of churches did them way back in 1995. We actually have a graphic of the teams from way back 1995. In that middle one, the turquoise team, you can see me at the bottom, Sean Chandler, and at the time, they didn't really know what they were doing yet. They had this idea of, what if instead of doing vacation Bible school where you have people come to the church, what if we trained the teenagers on how to share the gospel and poured into the teenagers so they were transformed, and then they took that message that changed their life and sent it out into the communities. That's a great idea. But exactly how to do that was still kind of the learning process. So the first year, this is 27 years later, a bunch of you went to boot camp. They've had 27 times to try and figure out the process of how to do it right. And multiple churches, so it's not actually 27, it's 27 times, a whole bunch. The number of times that a boot camp has happened for an Austin area church for this purpose. But way back in 1995, kind of still figuring out how this would all work. So the very first year, we actually stayed local and just slept on the floor of someone's house near the church, and then we would have to walk to the church for training each day. And then during the training, they ran out of ideas. Bobby ran out of ideas right there in the back. And so they literally, how are we going to prepare kids to teach the gospel? We'll play follow the leader in the parking lot. That's what they came up with. So with teenagers, we're like, all right, follow the leader, follow the person in front. Okay, that's kind of where we're at. Obviously, a lot more happened than just that. But that's the level of development of ideas. The back half of the week, we then moved from here in the Austin area, where we're right by our church we were coming out of, went to Waco to do Bible clubs in kind of some of the kind of lower income areas there. And we stayed at this place called Mission Waco, where once again we were just sleeping on the floors, and they didn't have enough showers, so we would shower with a hose. And that was kind of how this kind of looked like. And to drive us places, they crammed us into a Winnebago. Does anyone know what a Winnebago is? No. It's like a camping RV, except a really junky one from the 70s. They're used currently in Albuquerque to cook crystal meth as portable meth labs. That's really, if you've seen Breaking Bad, that's the point of reference. Portable meth lab. And this is way back in the 90s where we didn't think about the safety of teenagers. So they just took this many teenagers, just crammed them into a Winnebago, no seatbelts, driving. And it's not like Bobby has a bunch of training in driving a bad Winnebago with no brakes. He doesn't know how to do it. So I kid you not, we are driving to a club one day. The light turns red suddenly. He has to slam on the brakes. No one's wearing seatbelts. So when you have 40 people and they all kind of shuffle like this, the person in the back bumps the person in front of them. They don't fall very far. But then you start to have this wave of people falling over. And right by the door is a guy named Vincent Prendergast. He's the best man at my wedding. He's right by the door. Whole wave of people smack into him, knock him out the door. I kid you, he falls out the door. And he's holding on by one hand, dangling out of the car. This This is boot camp year 1. Somehow the program didn't get canceled. Yeah.
I want to do that.
And here's the real tragedy in that story. Someone filmed it when it happened.
Please.
And they recorded over. I told you it was a tragedy. They recorded over it. They filmed him falling out of the Winnebago and they recorded over it. So the greatest footage in boot camp history has been lost for all of eternity. Yeah. So we go to our clubs and we're still figuring out how to do this. We go to this area and they bring in all of this like sound equipment. The first year we did it, we had like Jesus puppets and puppet stands. And we had like barrels of candy bars. And we like, hey kids, come on out. We got free candy. We got a big show. And we didn't stop to think, what will happen if you do this?
Oh, man.
So all of a sudden, hundreds of kids start swarming us like bees for free candy. And so then we're like, uh-oh. And we start using our puppet stands as shields to block the candy. And hands are like reaching through and we're like slapping down hands. And then they start grabbing our Jesus puppets. And what do they do with the Jesus puppets? They did not eat the Jesus puppets. That would be fun if they did. They use them to cuss out little Vincent Prendergast. He's fallen out of a Winnebago, and now he's being cussed out by Jesus. This is how crazy gay boot camp year 1 is. And so it starts pouring rain, so the dangerous portable meth lab Winnebago drives back. We like literally are using our puppet stands as shields to rush to the Winnebago to get out of there as quickly as possible. And why do I say all this? First off, it's really funny how crazy the first thing is. But here's the thing, that was an awesome week. Why? Because the gospel was preached. Because the gospel was taken from, we were able to take the gospel to a community. Leaders poured into students poured into children. Even criminal children stealing Jesus puppets because of people out. And that is an amazing thing. And then likewise, you're a continuation of that legacy all the way up to this past week where things are a little bit more refined now. I was a driver this year, and they actually checked to make sure I had seat belts before they let me drive. Like, how many seat belts do you have? Okay, that's enough for your team, as opposed to back in the day where no one even cared about seat belts the first year. Now they care about that sort of thing, and it was more refined, but at its core, the same awesome stuff happened. And if you were there this past week, you probably didn't get enough sleep. Who here was pretty tired, stayed up way too late at the Spelling's house a lot? Anyone get a sunburn? Anyone get an injury? We got crutches over here. So for me, Wet and Wild Day, second club, I'm running around tossing water balloons. I don't know exactly what happened or how this happened, but apparently they had spicy water at this club. My contact on my eye split in half. But not totally, just mostly. So on my eye, it's just torn, so I can't see. And I'm still trying to have a water fight. I'm like, this is kind of uncomfortable. Wait, this isn't a little uncomfortable. This is really uncomfortable. And so I start trying to leave. They're like, Sean, just got a little water in your eye. I'm like, no! Something's wrong with my eye. I go inside and I literally see on my eye my contact torn in half. Pinch it off, throw it in the trash. Actually, I didn't throw it in the trash because I wanted to film it and post it on the internet because it's funny. And I'm a narcissist. But so, go outside. By the time I'm back, it's slip and slide time. Well, I got to go down the slip and slide. So I slide down the slip and slide all the way across onto the grass. But remember, I can't see. Got soap on my face, water it in my one good eye, and my other eye can't see anything. And so I just stepped straight down onto a pipe on the ground, and it just tears a hole in the bottom of my foot. Because I'm walking around on water, I can't notice it because it washes all the blood off of me. They're like, oh, it just hurts a little bit. I guess I'm fine. So I continue hanging out with the kids and all that stuff until I sit down during club time. They're like, oh, that's a lot of blood coming out of my foot. That's not good. So why do I say all this? It should be like this terrible thing. My contact tore out, my eye could have been destroyed. My foot was all kinds of messed up. But it was awesome. Why? Because the gospel was preached.
Amen.
And what happened this past week was a bunch of leaders a few weeks back at boot camp poured into a bunch of you, and then you went out and you poured the gospel into these kids all across Hutto, all across Taylor. And that is what we are all about. And so a bunch of leaders to drive you, they had to take off a week of work. That's a week they couldn't go on vacation. That's a week they couldn't stay home and play that video game that they bought 8 years ago. They wanted to play The Last of Us for the last 8 years. This is the week they could have done it, but instead they decided to drive you around. Some of you took off work to do Bible clubs. Who took off work to do Bible clubs this week? Why would you do that? Because this is what our mission is. This is what we are all about. And so today we're going to kind of look at how this has been the model all the way back to the beginning of the church. What Jesus did and then what Paul did. So we're looking at some of his final words to Timothy. So Timothy was one of the people that Paul was pouring into. For years he's pouring into Timothy. And then Paul knows he's about to die. So he's passing along his final words to Timothy. Like, how are we going to continue this thing spreading? How are we going to continue the church growing and the message of the gospel being spread? And he's writing his final words, and this is what he says. 2 Timothy 2:1. Then you, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And the things you have heard from me, say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will also be qualified to teach others. This verse right here is a big thing. This is what went on this past week. This is how the church has continued to spread and grow. That what has been poured into me, I try to pour into you, and that you continue to pour on to the people following after you. But our big idea for the day, our big idea is be strong and pass it along. Be strong and pass it along. When I say be strong, central piece to it, those truths, the Bible, the gospel, needs to transform you. That's the starting point. Is this message, this life-changing message that we are sinners in need of a Savior, and that the gospel means that we can be forgiven, that we can be part of God's story, that should transform us. That's the starting point. That we need to be transformed and be strong in the gospel. That's the starting point. Be strong. And it says in 2 Peter 1:3, His divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of Him who has called us by His own glory and goodness. So this is this message that empowers us to live a godly life. And the only natural response to a message that changes everything, like if the Bible is true, if the gospel is true, it changes everything. It changes your values. It changes what you should care about. Changes everything. And if it's true, if it's changed your life, the only natural response to a life-changing message is to pass it along. If you've been transformed, if you've been forgiven, if you think the gospel changes everything, the only natural response is to pass it along. Just think, what do we do when we learn about something that we think is awesome? You want to tell someone about it. So I've been married 15 and a half years now. Back, year number 1 of marriage. Might have even been on our honeymoon. I don't know what other people do on their honeymoons, but my wife was watching infomercials. She loves infomercials. And on our honeymoon, the infomercial for Hercules hooks came on. Hercules, I really thought we were going to get a round of applause for Hercules hooks. They're incredible. Yeah, they are amazing, amazing things. So this infomercial comes on where you're able to pull up, if you can play for us, this life-changing message about Hercules hooks.
The Hercules hook, one of the fastest and easiest ways to hang just about anything without any tools. No
Wow.
15 and a half years ago, learns about these Hercules hooks. And it blew her mind, so much so that to this day, if she's talking to someone and they're like, I need to hang something, I don't know what to use. She goes, I've got the solution. Hercules hooks. Have you tried Hercules hooks? You got to try Hercules hooks. And we were back in the office right back there, right before I started. I said, yeah, I'm going to bring up Hercules hooks. And she goes, really? Do you need me to talk about them? I can come up with... What?
Come on.
It's almost true what I just said. But so she got excited that I brought up Hercules hooks. And she's like, are you going to make fun of me? I was like, no, it's going to bring up Hercules hooks. She's like, they're awesome. 15 and a half years later, after watching what you just watched, she's still singing their praise because she thinks they're awesome. A little hook you put in the wall to hang shelves or your shotgun, in her case, whatever it is that you want to hang, you can hang it with these Hercules hooks. And so she's been talking about it for 15 years. Why? Because the natural response when you find something that's awesome is you want to tell other people about it. For a living, I talk about movies because I love movies. I think they're awesome, so I get excited. I just want to talk about them.
Sean Chandler.
That's right. That's me. That's what I do. I literally get excited about things, and I talk about them on the internet because the natural response when you're excited about something is to tell others about it. And if the gospel is true, if you've been transformed by the gospel and experienced what it can do for you, the natural response is to pass it along to others. And so as we kind of go into this, you just stop and think, who are the people that have poured into you? This whole process is someone pours into you and then you pour into others. Just stop and think, who are the people that have been incredibly important in your life and shaping who you are? If you don't know this, Bobby Pruitt was my youth pastor. So all back in the 90s, he was one of those people that I was hearing. Whoo! I almost kicked this over and I would have lost my notes and who knows what I would have said. One of those people that taught the Bible in a way that engaged me and I learned truth and it connected with me very early on. My small group leader when I was in high school was a guy named Jack Cromer. And he wasn't the youngest youth leader by any stretch. He was in his 50s way back then. And he had us over and he had a Nintendo 64. So we'd go over to his place and we would play GoldenEye and then we'd open the Bible. And we'd spend time in these Bible studies. And this guy would give up a night of his week because he had had so much pain and trauma in his past before he became a Christian. And then he found the message of grace, the gospel, and it changed him. And he was willing to just give up his time to pour into teenagers so that they could hear that message that had changed him. And his hope was he could get them to be changed by the message before they would experience the pain that sin brought into his life. So Jack Cromer was one of those people when I was in high school that gave up his time to pour into me. When I was in my early 20s, there was a guy named Jason Smith. He was the first youth pastor at Hill Country Pflugerville. I think it's Parkview now. He was the first youth pastor over there, and I interned under him, and so he kind of poured into me to kind of help me learn how to be someone that made disciples. One of the people that attends here named Tom Albers, who's been here forever, and I've known him for 20 years. Another great mentor that's poured into me. And so who are the people that have poured into you? Some of you have awesome parents, and they've been pouring into you since you were a child. And they're one of those people that have shaped you to love Jesus and introduced you to the gospel. Other people, you can think about who your small group leaders are. Who are the people that have poured into you? Passage continues on. If we can put it back up here, it says, or actually it doesn't continue. Going back to the verse, because we're just looking at this one verse really. 2 Timothy 2:2. There's 4 generations that you see here. And the things that you have heard from me, trust to reliable men who will also be qualified to teach others. So in the context of this one, that's Paul is teaching Timothy that he wants it to trust to reliable men who are able to teach other people. Or to put it another way, there's 4 generations: your teacher, you, your student, their student. That's the way that the gospel has continued to spread and the way the disciples have continued to be made. So someone pours into you, and then you pour into someone else. And the crazy part about some of this is that you just never know what God's going to do with your faithfulness. You never know what God's going to do with a small act of obedience and who God will choose to use. Like for me, when I was in middle school, these days I'm still a pretty awkward and weird person, but I've learned to at least be mildly self-aware of it. When I was in middle school, I was just a freaking weirdo. I would wear 2 different shoes because I just didn't know any better. I didn't care. I was like, just wear whatever 2 shoes I found. And it would be like a combat boot on one foot and like a tennis shoe on the other, a flip-flop. And people like, why are you wearing 2 different shoes? I was like, those are the 2 I found. And my reputation was so peculiar. The first year at boot camp, they did skits. The girls did skits to kind of honor all the boys in the youth group. And so they did like a little skit pretending to be each of the boys. Great. These are always great ideas. Their skit for me was a girl who just walked into a wall and fell over. And everyone went, it's Sean. Like that's what they had for me, was he walks into walls and falls over. That was my entire reputation. That was me. That was who I was. First couple years at boot camp, they had during the training, if you couldn't pass your gospel, they would send you home. Because you had to be able to pass your gospel test before you could go to Waco. And every year, I would pass the test 20 minutes. 20 minutes before we left. Literally, they're counting down like, guys, keep studying. You've got to pass this. And so I got my gospel right as they were loading up the vehicle. That's how bad I was at doing this stuff. And then I was a captain one year and got in trouble. Bobby actually literally sat me down to tell me how I was a bad captain. And then they didn't have me back as a captain next year. And he was right. I was a terrible captain because I don't know. I was kind of checked out until I was like 22 years old, and then like the light switch went on. Why do I always say all this? Because if you saw me in middle school, if you saw me in high school, if you saw me when I was even 20, you'd be like, that guy probably shouldn't be teaching the Bible to people. That guy is cuckoo. But here we are. Because you never know what God will do. If it was just me, I'd probably be homeless because I'd be walking into walls. But God changes lives. God changes lives. And so you just never know what God will do. Like I said, we have the model that it has in there. Give your teacher to you, to the next generation, and to their students. Kind of play this out even a little bit. Bobby taught me. Then Trey Dove was one of my students in my student ministry when I was the youth pastor here. I poured into him, and then he was the youth pastor here for 5 years and poured into a bunch of you. And then now you're pouring into, with your team captains, you are pouring into your team, you're pouring into the students. You just see the generations as it happens. That's God's plan. Someone pours into you, then you pour into someone else, and then they pour into someone else, and it continues on and on. That's how disciples are made. That's how the gospel spread. You can even look in this room. Sarah's right there in the back. Who was her D group leader when she was in student ministry? Shannon Baxter. So Shannon poured into her. Now Sarah's pouring into you. And that's the pattern you keep seeing. Andy King, another one of my students. So Jason Worthen poured into him. And then he poured into others. And that continues on and on. That is the pattern. And now you're that next piece in that journey of passing along the gospel. And that's what took place this last week. And that's what kind of this message is all about. So we kind of close out, ask 2 questions we kind of already asked in here. To make it real clear, 2 questions. Who's pouring into you? So you kind of look at this next school year. And maybe some of you going off to college. One of the big questions you should be asking is where are you going to get plugged in so someone continue to pour into you? But if you think about this next school year, what are you going to do to make sure that someone is continuing to pour into you? And then the other side to it, who are you going to pour into? Continuing that process of disciple making, being poured into, being transformed. Be strong, and then pass it along. And the cool thing about this is you just really never know what God is going to do with simple acts of faithfulness. You really never know. So my mom didn't grow up really going to church. Maybe like, if you had to check a box, she might have said that she was a Christian just because that's, oh yeah, we're Christian. Didn't really go to church, didn't know the gospel. In high school, she stopped doing sports and she started doing drugs instead, which is really funny if you know my mom now. Kind of how kind of rebellious she was. And when she was in high school, started dating a guy that was 25, divorced, and had a kid, which I have so many questions about now, but that's my dad. And so they got married right after she graduated from high school. And they ended up kind of traveling the kind of world because of his work. And while she's in Singapore, her neighbor comes over and starts talking to her about the gospel. And it started actually kind of debating politics and social issues. That's where it started. And then this person brought up the gospel. Something that my mom hadn't ever heard before. She hears this message, and it starts to kind of change her a little bit. And eventually, she prays to receive Christ with her neighbor while in Singapore. And because of that, she raised my sister and I in the church. And that's where I heard the gospel. And the first year of Backyard Bible Clubs, that's when I point to when I first put my faith in Christ. When it stopped being information that I knew where I could pass the test, started being something personal. That I actually trusted Jesus as my Savior to forgive my sins. That started with that boot camp that we talked about where people are falling out of Winnebagos. It started that summer. And then all that led to the moment where I'm here talking to you right now. This right now goes back to a simple act of faithfulness over 40 years ago. That's just crazy to me, the way that God works, and the way that God uses simple acts of obedience. A neighbor deciding, I'm going to tell this young mom about Jesus, back in like 1980. And then that path has led to the fact that I'm here now. My mom's been on staff at Hill Country Food or Parkview for over 20 years now, pouring into people's lives. All goes back to one act of obedience in 1980 that God used to transform hundreds, in a sense, thousands of lives. And then likewise, a piece of little part of your kind of spiritual journey that you're going to take what I'm pouring into you and you pour into others. One piece of that goes back to, some sense of that goes back to an act of faithfulness in 1980. One of my favorite verses that I love to bring up every summer in the middle of Backyard Bible Club season is Ephesians 3:20. It says, "Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine according to his power that works within us." That story I just told about my mom. Her neighbor, when she walked over next door and decided to talk about Jesus, she wasn't thinking 42 years later, this lady's son's going to be speaking to a room of, 40, 50 teenagers. It was immeasurably more than she could have asked or imagined. As I think about what happened this past week with you guys taking the gospel to Hutto and to Taylor, God's going to do immeasurably more than you could ask or imagine with that act of faithfulness. As we go into this next school year, the small little acts of faithfulness that you have when you talk to a classmate, when you invite someone to church, God will do immeasurably more than you can ask or imagine with those small little acts of faithfulness. It all kind of goes back to that central principle. Be strong. Be transformed by this message and pass it along. And just let's close out on this simple note. Wasn't this last week awesome? I mean, it was incredible. Because that's what this is all about. Making Jesus known by spreading the gospel and spreading this life-changing message. Let's pray.